Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another exciting session of Gather to Grow here with Food from Zanzi. My name is Dawn Numdu. I'm your host for this session, and I'm really excited about it. We have our speakers that are here. I think we're just waiting for one more speaker, and then I have my awesome co-host, Guguletu, who's joining me to talk about hemp versus marijuana, the ultimate guide for new farmers. Gugu, are you excited as I am for this phase?
Hi, Dawn. Absolutely. I'm so excited. Hemp, marijuana, weed is the new buzzword, and I'm really excited for our guest speakers to really share some insights on opportunities we as young aspiring farmers have.
Yes, definitely. And I must say that I'm really excited about our expert panel speakers that are here joining us tonight. I'll kick off by asking them just to tell us a little bit about what they do, how they fit into the industry. And I'm going to start with the front runner. Sibusiso, he's the co-founder and CEO of Africa Cannabis Advisory Group. They are leading service providers specialized in medical cannabis in the hemp industry. Sibusiso, thanks so much for joining us and welcome dear to Gather to Grow with Food Zanzi.
Thank you so much for today's session and for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here and thanks so much for being part of this conversation. Not someone new to the space, but she's been with us on a few sessions. Conse Moraba is an agricultural economist and strategy and operations analyst at one of South Africa's leading agrochemical companies. Conse, great to have you back on Gather to Grow, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And for those that do not know me, I am Conse Moraba. I'm an agricultural economist with 2 years working in the financial sector, but I am now in the agrochemical space. I also have a YouTube channel dedicated to all things agriculture where we share our insights called Food for Thought with Karabo and Conse.
Thanks so much. And I must say, I enjoy your channel. Lots of great insights there. And I follow you guys. So thanks so much for sharing all of that with us and just for championing the agricultural sector continuously, Conse. And then I have Arne. Arne is from Hemp Hub. Arne, welcome to Gather to Grow. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks a lot. It's one of the favorite subjects, ranting about the struggles of the cannabis industry.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was one of the points that he said to me when he agreed to be here. He's like, as long as I can rant, it's fine. So I was like, no, this is a space where you can do that. And then last but not least, Trishalan is the co-founder and CEO of Multidime and Native Genetics. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us and being here.
Yeah, my name is Trishalan Munsami. I represent Multidime. We are a medicine company involved in the commercial cultivation of cannabis as well as other plant medicines and looking at the sort of cohesion of the commercial sector as well as the rural agricultural communities in South Africa to participate in the cannabis economy. So it's one of our bigger drivers. So thanks again for having us this evening.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much to my colleague Nicole for connecting me with you. She was obviously also at the summit that happened recently. So thank you so much just for engaging with us, even on Food from Zanzi. It's great to have you with us. Gugu, I'm going to go with my first question and then we'll just roll with it. I think tonight we want to be very specific with our time because I'm sure everyone has lots to say and lots to contribute. So let's set the scene by starting with how the cannabis industry currently operates in Mzansi. For the newbie farmer or anyone who has an interest but wants to know what they're stepping into, what should they be aware of?
Maybe I can take this one. So just to provide a little bit of context in terms of what the lay of the land looks like in the South African cannabis industry. So we really have basically all the 3 verticals in terms of legal cannabis activity in South Africa. The first one being decriminalized cultivation, which is essentially the result of the 2018 Constitutional Court ruling that the cultivation and consumption of cannabis within a private space is a human right. So that's got nothing to do with any sort of commercial activity, but a lot of individuals will be growing and consuming cannabis in a private space. Under that framework, the trading of cannabis is not legal. So I think one of the big misconceptions in South Africa at the moment is the thinking that that court ruling basically legalized the trading of cannabis, and that isn't the case. The second vertical in terms of a regulated or legal framework for cannabis is around medical cannabis. So since 2019, SAPRA has been issuing medical cannabis cultivation licenses. There's just under 60 licenses that have been issued to date. The growing activity under the medical cannabis regime is very, very different to agriculture in that you typically grow in a controlled environment. So a greenhouse or even indoor cultivation is very popular here. Sort of growing outdoors or under nets, for example, is probably not an industry best practice because ultimately your product has to meet pharmaceutical standards, and the current framework in South Africa allows for exports only. So you actually have to grow to meet an Australian or Israeli or German standard. And so that happens under a controlled environment or indoor. And then lastly, we've got the industrial hemp framework that's governed under the Department of Agriculture. And that is sort of more the traditional agricultural framework. So cultivation there typically happens outdoors, large scale. The Department of Agriculture began taking applications in cultivation towards the end of last year. To my knowledge, there haven't been any permits that have been issued as yet. That basically summarizes the sort of different verticals currently in South Africa.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Luciso. Sounds very, very interesting. There is an interest in obviously CBD and it's continuing to grow. And there's a lot of available different hemp CBD products that we are now actually seeing in the market. But a factor that I think often confuses a lot of people is whether cannabis, CBD, in the products that we are seeing in the shops come from hemp or cannabis. So maybe one of the speakers could define and help us understand what is the difference between hemp, cannabis, marijuana.
The actual difference between hemp and marijuana is purely arbitrary. It was a limit to the psychoactive constituent, THC, that first the European Union set and then Canada followed suit. Generally, it's about 0.2 to 0.3% THC in the actual material, but how it's spoken about, hemp is only for industrial purposes. So if you want CBD, if you get it from Europe, you're likely getting it from hemp. If you're getting it from North America, you're likely getting it from quote-unquote marijuana. It's all cannabis. The elephant in the room is, of course, Chinese CBD, and they blur the line between hemp and marijuana even further by using these naturally occurring plants, sometimes not, in a gray area of the law, but government condoned. And it's estimated about 50% of CBD does in fact come from China. And then it goes through a whitewashing process through either of the two Western continents.
So then why would anyone, especially farmers, because I know there's a lot of farmers are on the space, why would anyone consider CBD? What's in cannabis? What's in it for us in terms of the market?
I will be very honest with you and very blunt. Pursuing CBD in the South African context is only for a very few select companies. There is such a global production. For example, US companies have literally stockpiles of the stuff. If you want to go into the cannabis market, be very careful of going into CBD because you need to bring something quite spectacular to market in order to compete, at least internationally. We need to find things that work for South Africa. And CBD, the market has been one. Currently, you can get CBD, for only a few thousand rand a kilo from 300,000 rand in 2015. So I would definitely suggest do not look at CBD. Look at industrial purposes. Look at medical or recreational dacha.
Maybe we can get some of our other speakers to say whether they agree with what Anna is saying, whether they have a difference in opinion, and then maybe also just as a follow-up question to Pusi, so you believe that South Africa's sleeping giant has the potential to become a major player, in the global cannabis market, and maybe we can also just unpack this a little bit more.
I definitely on his points. The CBD market CBD was very much the compound within cannabis that pretty much led the way in terms of legalization. So America in 2018 legalized the cultivation of hemp for CBD, and a number of European countries are also very active. So the pricing over the last 3 years has probably collapsed by 80 to 90%. I definitely second that. With CBD, the players that we are working with that are doing well within the space are usually companies that have actually got end products and branded end products. So for example, CBD we've got a client in the US that uses CBD in sports nutrition shakes, so as a pre and post workout. And because they're building a brand and they can command a level of margin with the consumer and their input cost being CBDs is declining, they're actually in quite a good place. So if you are able to actually build a brand or develop proprietary formulation with CBD as an input that is consumer facing or consumer touching, I think that's a possibility. But on purely the cultivation side, it's fairly challenging. And maybe just to briefly touch on the point that you raised about the potential of South Africa in the cannabis industry. So we definitely believe that South Africa has got immense potential to be the leading African cannabis economy, as well as be very strong and relevant in terms of the international cannabis supply chain for a number of reasons. Number one, South Africa currently has hundreds and thousands of traditional indigenous growers who have developed expertise around cannabis cultivation, different strains, etc. So in a legal framework, we can tap a lot of that expertise and skills to really sort of drive product development and so forth. And that also comes in terms of local strains or landrace strains that are unique to South Africa. Number two, South Africa has got as everyone knows, a very strong agricultural industry with strong international offtake and credibility. as well as a strong pharmaceutical industry. And both of those together form a very good foundation in terms of expertise, capital, infrastructure that can support South Africa as a global cannabis player. And then thirdly, I think South Africa also has quite a large-scale domestic market. And unlike many other countries or most other countries in the world, our government has indicated the clear intention of fully legalizing cannabis for domestic use and consumption. And so the strength in terms of purchasing power in South Africa domestically and those other factors that I've mentioned put South Africa in quite a strong position to be able to really be the leading cannabis economy on the continent and one of the leading ones internationally.
Ansa, I see you want to unmute there. Would you like to contribute?
Yes, just to add on what Spusiso and Anu said, there are real opportunities for entrepreneurs in this sector. I mean, this includes not just limited to the cultivation and the production, but when you're thinking hydroponics, if you're going to go and producing, especially industrial hemp, if you're going in that line, textiles, the environmentally friendly plastics, we're looking at chemicals, you're looking at new strand developments, you're looking at seed distribution, seed development, logistics, transport. So from an economic point of view, the industry is really like untapped, and there's a plateau of opportunities that can open if it is industrialized, like the president has mentioned at the SONA address, as well as the legal and the barriers to entries are taken care of. And also just to add to one of the important factors that Spusiso has highlighted, South Africa's climate is very, very favorable for production of cannabis, especially when you're looking at KZN. I mean, it is humid, it is warm, so this will actually have lower input costs in terms of production, unlike what we see in Canada, where most of the production is in the greenhouse or in tunnels. This, you can have like an open field production of hemp. In that aspect, there's definitely a scope to look into this market.
Thanks so much, Consa. Trish, would you maybe like to add something here?
No, I agree with all of the speakers. I think all of the points were very relevant. For the last few years, there's been a big hype around the cannabis industry. And for those that have chosen to sort of spearhead it and be able to participate as a market, there have been a lot of sort of challenges, especially around governance and regulation. Obviously it's taken quite some time than how one would sort of commercialize the sector. And just very recently, the TTIC has asked SARS to create a cannabis tariff subcategory for South African Cannabis Customs Union, which would basically mean that...
Hi, Dawn, did we lose Trisha?
I think we did, yes, Gugu. I was actually just hoping that I thought maybe it was just my side, but you can go ahead with your next question. I know that you wanted to contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really interesting. And, I know the government is also, actively pursuing the youth to really get involved in cannabis. What I need to understand now is that before I just ask you guys in terms of the production of cannabis, is the permit. Spusiso did mention that, it is quite a headache. I know that you need a special permit to import the seeds. So you need like a permit from the Department of Agriculture for you to even start planting, right? And then I'm not sure if it also is applicable to South Africa, but in Canada, they need hemp farmers, need like permission to farm hemp and supply GPS of the corners of the hemp production area. So they want to see that, you're not growing hemp anywhere else. The permits and the licensing seem like a bottleneck for anyone really interested in that. So I just wanted to know, where do we go in terms of acquiring, what permits do we need to start and how much do they cost?
In terms of South Africa, there's really two types of permits or licenses in cannabis currently. The first one is for medical cannabis, and that have been in place since 2019. With medical cannabis, it's extremely capital intensive. So the license in and of itself, the application is about 24,000 Rand. But the big challenge is that the regulator, SAPRA, actually requires you to develop your facility first, and then it gets audited. And then if they are happy, they will grant you a license. And typically the capital required to develop a facility that can sort of meet international standards and so forth is sort of a minimum of at least 10 million Rand. You can build cheaper facilities and probably get licensed, which is what a lot of people have done. But what they then find is that once they've started planting and growing, there's a whole host of challenges in terms of product consistency. That is an extremely capital intensive and difficult part. It's not impossible. There are a lot of young entrepreneurs in this process, and we work with quite a lot of them in terms of taking them through the entire process and raising capital and so forth. But it is extremely restrictive. I think one of the major efforts is sort of lobbying for this to be reorientated to allow it to be more accessible. And then secondly is the industrial hemp permits. And those are the ones that the Department of Agriculture began to take applications for at the end of last year. And those are a lot less capital intensive. I think it's a few hundred Rand to apply. But the big challenge there is that one of the requirements for you to actually get a permit is for you to have secured fencing around the property. Your cultivation area is 50 hectares. You can just imagine how expensive that will get in terms of that prerequisite for getting the capital. So those are the two main legal licensing / permit frameworks currently in South Africa.
Thanks so much, Sibusi. So I think you've given us quite a bit to think about in terms of the costs that you'd need to keep in mind when wanting to start or enter the sector. Let's talk a bit about the marketing and advertising. Now, as I understand it, cannabis companies cannot reach the general public due to legislation around advertising and marketing. But how can farmers work around this? Any advice? And do you guys see this changing as things change in terms of the legalization and how the industry is moving? And I think that maybe you'd like to take this one or any of our speakers.
Cannabinoid products fall under quite strict laws. CBD is the easiest to supply to market. But for the rest of it, the rest of the plant, at least industrially, you're welcome to advertise and market as you please. I'm talking about seeds. I'm talking about the woody biomass, so fibers and shivs. With CBD, you can pretty much advertise openly as long as it obviously meets legal requirements. Biggest struggle is on social media networks who still frown a lot on cannabis marketing, and they often include CBD in that. But we are not as restricted as what Canada is, for example, or at least what the cannabis companies in Canada claim they are.
Trish, I saw that you also wanted to respond to the question. Would you like to contribute?
Yeah, unfortunately, the market for cannabis is still an issue. And that, I think, predominantly lies in respect to the local commercialization of cannabis. So to date, we've only been able to export CBD and derivative from companies or countries where we have registered product. And unfortunately, in this country, we are still yet to register many of our product. And that obviously speaks to genetic profiles and where we acquire the seeds and how we cultivate them and the standards that they go through. There is, of course, as we've seen with regards to public enthusiasm, that there have been many products that have been coming to market, especially with regards to social impact programs that have been coming around these social clubs. And the guys that have been putting together these social clubs and being able to cultivate certain plants and genetics and being able to provide these derivatives to their members. And so that's obviously been able to fuel a lot of the enthusiasm around the sector as well. So in respect of marketing, and of course, it's a no-go for now. And governments, obviously, what they're requesting is that, things happen on sort of a membership basis. And there's a sort of a very strict protocol that happens in your social clubs, especially with the fact that it should not be for profit and one should not be seen to transact or administer in any way. So it is still very much a limited capacity in the way we can expose or advertise the work that we're doing.
Thanks so much for that. I know Gugu is burning the very farmer in her question in terms of how to grow. So Gugu, you can go and I'll ask the rest of my questions later.
Yeah, Dawn, absolutely, you know me. I really would like to know, in terms of just the production of hemp, why a farmer would consider it, maybe, even as part of their rotation. If you guys can just give us a guide to the growing of hemp for seed and maybe the growing of hemp for textile purposes, for fiber, are there any differences in that? How much can we sell it to the agro processors?
Hemp, you grow on a massive scale. You're aiming for tens of thousands of plants per hectare. It works great in rotations. In fact, in standard rotations, it is after legumes like soy, of course. It's very nitrogen intensive, anything that follows that. It is also a perfect crop to grow before wheat because certain studies, including a Spanish one, found these yield increases in wheat when it was preceded by hemp. Regards to what kind of crop you plant, if you want to grow for fiber, you're going to harvest before seed maturity, especially for textiles. Textiles is probably one of you have to get it right to get a really good quality fiber because it is a bast fiber. So you harvest at a certain date before seed maturity, and that tends to go for fiber production. Your waste is then the woody shivs, which is the inner core of the plant. And this, of course, can be used for building, etc., chipboards, you name it. You can grow dual-purpose crops. So generally that's for seeds and then for biomass. And this biomass also goes into industrial fibers, also for building, etc. If you look at Futura, which is a common European variety, it's called Futura 75. That you're looking at about 10 tons to a hectare. 8 of that is good biomass. And then the seed yield, if you grow it for seed, is about, if you're a good farmer, about 750 kilos, which is not a lot. But obviously the seed is a high value product, both as a pressed oil for the protein content and as whole seed. The last farm gate prices I heard was around about 16 to 20 Rand a kilo. You do need processing equipment to process the seeds. Generally, the seeds need to be dried as well because you're not harvesting at complete seed dryness to avoid seeds dropping off. And equipment to use is generally people do different combine harvesters. They will put a maize cutter on a wheat header, for example. So custom machines, and then several manufacturers, including Claas, have made these hemp-specific harvesters. I do also just have to add the caveat that hemp production and just cannabis production in general is very nuanced. So it depends on what you want to grow for, how you are going to grow that plant. Some producers also harvest leaves, also harvest for cannabinoids like CBD. How you're going to grow it depends on what you're going to do with it.
Wow, that's
Definitely.
very interesting.
I think maybe just one other point regarding hemp. So there are over 50,000 end products that can be created from hemp. So textiles, as mentioned, hempcrete, which is a substitute to cement in construction, can be used for insulation, clothing, etc. But one of the biggest challenges in terms of the hemp industry is the fact that the supply chain, and definitely in South Africa, but in actually even most parts of the world, isn't developed as yet. For example, as much as we know that there are all these uses for hemp, the big challenge is actually being able to connect, the farmer to the fashion retailer in terms of converting that biomass to a t-shirt, for example. And it can't be understated how difficult it is to develop the supply chains, especially at scale. There's numerous sort of case studies around the world where in different parts of that supply chain, different companies and operators and entrepreneurs have failed because of various reasons, but a lot of it has to do with sort of the sequencing of how the supply chain is developed. And to the point made earlier, what I'll term attention to detail in terms of getting the right type of biomass for the end use. For me, that's the biggest challenge that lies ahead for South Africa in terms of developing the hemp industry.
I completely agree with Sibusiso. Just because this massive potential market doesn't mean the potential is there yet. The most logical, the most obvious way to approach hemp is to use it as an ingredient in pre-existing supply chains. For example, paper. In the craft process of making paper, you can substitute 20% of the wood in that production process without changing a single thing. And suddenly, well, at least some Polish paper institute, something to that tune, they found that their yield of paper increased by around about 2.5%. So there's an existing supply chain. We are massive consumers of paper. I think South Africa goes through something like 2.5 million tons of paper products every year. We have world-renowned paper producers. There's a great supply chain and it's existing. We don't have to create a market from scratch. And the same goes for just substituting. Hempcrete is such a great building material, and activists have been moaning to government for years. This is what you need to use for RDP houses, for example. So either find something that links into an existing supply chain or something whose innovation is undeniable and will replace a lesser material for a purpose.
I think the interesting thing now is that, is it safe to say that hemp is organic? When, with the organic market booming, can't we introduce hemp as such as an organic product on our own and then get into a whole value chain, because it requires a few or if any pesticides. It grows very quick. We all know that. And in some cases, actually in most cases, we know that, hemp kills some weeds. It purifies your soil. So it's such an advantageous crop to grow. I'm surprised why we're battling to create a purely hemp production line and value chain.
You are, of course, very right. And many cannabis varieties do not suffer many pests. There are a few notable ones. In my experience, growing a whole host of European hemp varieties, they are not as pest resistant as their, let's call it, their stronger counterparts. They suffer incredibly from things like aphids, from cotton bollworm. With regards to weeds, there's many trials that have just completely floundered because the hemp couldn't establish before weed pressure regained. Even though this is a commonly repeated maxim, it's not true for all cases, and especially not if we're growing these softer varieties that classify as hemp, at least as hemp in a Western sense. We'd be far better off growing Chinese varieties that have a more full cannabinoid profile. They are better suited to our country by far. They don't have excessive amounts of THC, so would not be the first choice for a recreational use or criminal intent. You have to be very careful on what variety you grow, especially if you want to grow organically, even though it's entirely possible. And that is a great market to be in. This is what has carried the hemp market all the way, is just the sustainability of it, the ability that it can clean up soils and we can capture carbon by the ton load every season. Once again, that nuance of cannabis means that this is not a rule as what it is often repeated as. One just has to look at the massive environmental impacts of cannabis production in places like California or Oregon, and just the energy used in, for example, Dutch cannabis production. Then, of course, there's many conventional farmers just growing industrial hemp, following very conventional pest protocols, because that works for them, number one, and two, that makes it economically viable for.
Thanks so much, Arne. Dr. Ethel Perry, you can take the floor, and then just to contribute or have a question or maybe just to add to the conversation here on Gather to Grow.
My background and research interests are in sustainable agriculture, particularly social, economic, and environmental sustainability. So my question is mostly around those small-scale farmers, especially the ones that we know mainly in the Eastern Cape that have been growing cannabis, not necessarily hemp. They've been growing marijuana for so many years. And what's the feeling of the panelists in the fact that with all the legislations, with the legalization on the growing of cannabis and how these farmers are actually sidelined? Me living in Stellenbosch and seeing the large farm spaces that the strawberry farmer has now decided that they, instead of growing strawberries, they're now going to be large-scale producers of cannabis because they've got the capital to have three-step security and all these other things that are required by the government. So what's the opinion of our panel members on this?
Thanks so much, Dr. Perry. Great insight. You can go ahead, Arne.
So I live in the Eastern Cape. I've spent many an hour in the very rural areas around Lusikisiki and the like. These people have been very proudly and fiercely growing cannabis as their bread-winning crop. I honestly don't think that people realize that we are literally speaking of tens of thousands of families dependent on this crop that have been traditionally growing it despite what are effectively apartheid laws. It doesn't take much of a Google search to realize that cannabis prohibition is fundamentally one of the last apartheid laws. For example, the Amapundu have been persecuted by the government, even so far as weed killers being sprayed over their homesteads, over their cows, over their children, over their maize, just to kill their traditional crop. And yet they are still growing. Today, they are starving once again because everybody's growing pot. So suddenly, no one wants to buy their landrace cannabis anymore because every guy and his best friend are growing indoors, etc. Whereas their landrace cannabis is particularly suited to a particular environment. It's been shaped by the natural forces in that Eden of theirs over centuries, as far as we know. And yet now they can't sell it. This doesn't mean that there isn't opportunity for them. If government gets their act together, instead of trying to westernize their production, why not modernize their production, incorporate a social upliftment into their cannabis production? Currently, everybody there, as far as I burns their hemp stalks, for example. They literally just burn it because what else do they do? This can be turned into industrial hemp products. You perhaps can't harvest textiles, but you can harvest biomass for the various processes. And they produce, our estimate is about every family produces about 200 kilos of seed just from their crops because it's all open grown. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that there needs to be special attention paid to these farmers who have it as their birthright to grow cannabis, that have grown it despite being persecuted by an evil regime, despite subjected to chemical warfare effectively by the South African Police Service, despite their children still being arrested, still spending years in jail for transporting their crop, first on donkeys, then on everything from Avanzas and public buses to their markets, which tend to be the large informal settlements. They take these risks because this is the only thing that they grow successfully as a cash crop in those areas, and it's drying up and no support is being given to these people except for telling them, oh, you should grow hemp. It's a tragedy that's unfolding in front of our eyes, and if we're not careful, these people will once again be left behind and just persecuted through bureaucracy instead of now police spraying Roundup over their stock.
And in preparation for this, Arne, I actually came across an article that we had covered specifically on this issue on Food for Mzansi, where the lawyer Ricky Stone said that he believes that this crop should be treated like any agricultural commodity, and this is the only way that you can really genuinely unlock its potential to humanity. And this is obviously representative of these farmers that you're referring to, the Amapondo cannabis farmers in the Eastern Cape. But yeah, I think there's so much to unpack and so much to talk about specifically on that topic. And I see that we have people who'd like to contribute. Kasi, I'm giving you the floor. You can unmute your mic and contribute, and then I'll go to Kamau after that.
My name is Klux. I'm an agricultural student based in Potchefstroom. I'm studying at Potchefstroom College of Agriculture. So I've just got 2 comments, and I'll try to be quick. I'm of a different view to our panel regarding specifically CBD. The general comment is that the CBD space is saturated. I don't agree with the statement, but I think to qualify it, CBD is saturated in a particular market. So in South Africa, and I would believe the trend is also global, we're seeing CBD being made into particular products that are sold in certain places in South Africa, in Sandton, in Cape Town, Durban, and a few Clicks and Discam stores. But in general, it hasn't really penetrated the South African market as much. So I believe CBD is saturated if we follow the European and American standards of growing hemp and cannabis, because that's what South Africa is doing mostly. We are being subjected to growing in tunnels and these indoor facilities, which are expensive. However, like the speakers have said, in South Africa, we've got an optimal climate to grow outdoors, to grow both hemp and cannabis outdoors. To an extent, some of the cannabis that can be outdoor is good enough to be medicinal grade, because obviously cannabis that is grown for medicinal purposes will target different ailments, and some of those ailments can be targeted with cannabis that's grown outdoor. Because the speaker did mention that there's no real significant difference in hemp and cannabis except for the chemistry, so the level of THC that we have, but both are one thing. I believe in that regard, CBD can be saturated, but if we open it up and say that you are allowed to grow hemp and cannabis outdoors to make whatever product, including CBD product, then it will become cheaper. Obviously, the manufacturing and extraction and processing part will still become expensive, but once we have economies of scale, so once we have a lot of people who are supplying the raw product, it becomes much cheaper, and then that way it won't only be available in high LSM areas. We can get it to the low LSMs, because we're talking about people in the Eastern Cape and disadvantaged communities. They haven't had access to these CBD products, except maybe in the traditional ways that they manufacture them. But I don't see how we can speak about a CBD industry that's saturated when the majority of South Africans haven't accessed it. So that's my comment on CBD. I think there's a lot of exclusion, and it's driven by a lot of these European and US-based companies. Guguletu, I believe, had a question about what farmers must do with regards to hemp. What are we going to do? Because Busiso was right. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done in the hemp industry. People have applied to grow. I know that the applications with the Department of Agriculture have closed as of the 31st of March because they're trying to take out permits. But a lot of people are interested in growing, don't even know what they're going to do. And there's a lot of value chain development that needs to be done. It's going to be expensive, from a cultivation all the way to processing to getting product to market point of view. So there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done in order to establish that industry. However, as a farmer, we can look inwards, because one of the things that we can do with hemp is animal feed. So obviously everything is cultivar specific. You have to do your research, look for seeds that will give you enough seeds or flour. Although the government is a bit finicky about that, because as soon as you start processing flour, they talk about medicines. But you can even use the leaves for the sake of producing animal feed, for your animals on the farm, for your neighbors' animals. So we can start with those simplistic measures, because currently I believe the cap is 50 hectares. Each applicant is allowed to only apply for 50 hectares. So with those 50 hectares, we can't do a great deal. There's a lot that you can do with 50 hectares, don't get me wrong, but you can't do a great deal. So I think we need to start developing products on a very small scale, so that we can start developing the value chain and we can start including other farmers, and then the caps will be removed. But as farmers, one of the answers that we can give is grow cultivars that are good for animal feed. I know pigs can chow the whole plant as it is. They don't need too much. Some animals need a bit of processing. Cattle, you need to do some level of processing, but it's not too complicated. Some of the machines that can be used are available on the farm, and just a bit of tweaking is needed. You can press for oil, like other people have mentioned. So we can start in those ways. But essentially what we need to shy away from is exclusions, because the cannabis industry, as it is going in South Africa currently, is very exclusionary, including even the private purpose model. Like Sbu said, that currently you can't sell cannabis for private consumption, but clubs are. They're operating under an NPC or NPO model, but they're making money. There's 18 clubs that belong to an institution called Grow in Africa. They're operating almost like businesses, and they're making money. They're making a profit. Obviously, they have certain objectives as NPC or NPOs, but at the end of the day, they are making money. So it all just speaks towards exclusion. If you can afford lawyers, if you can afford machines, if you can afford that, you can enter. If you can't afford, you can't enter, and we need to address those things as soon as possible.
Thank you so much. Christina, you can take the floor.
My name is Christina Gubic. I'm a communication specialist focusing on sustainability and environmental issues. One of the things that really strikes me is the sort of collective knowledge on this space. And I'm just wondering, if there isn't maybe a feasibility study or a paper that documents the entire value chain and the potential for product applications, job opportunities, and skill deficits, that we could really position more professionally. If there is such a report, I'd like to read it. If there isn't, I would like to help author it. The second point around traditional growers in rural communities, I think we've all got a lot of experience with cooperatives, and sometimes they can be their worst enemies. Sometimes there's a lot of infighting, but one of the suggestions things that you alluded to, I think something that could be very valuable is the legal precedent around indigenous knowledge systems and how the Khoisan won their argument around owning the intellectual property on Hoodia and Buhu. And that could be something that could be taken further with environmental lawyers. And then lastly, what Arne was saying around substituting a portion of hemp into paper fiber. I mean, this is definitely something that corporates like Sappi and Mondi would be interested in hearing on, improving their sustainability scorecard. And potentially, this group could represent at Sustainability Week, which is hosted every year. I think it's around September. I could be mistaken, but certainly something to look into.
Thank you so much, Christina. Lots of amazing points made. Kamau, you have the floor.
So I had a question. Farmer who would be willing to do hemp in open field. What is the best season to plant? Is it the long rains or the short rains? And what climate is best conducive for hemp? Also, would want to know about, are there any diseases that affect both hemp and marijuana?
Thanks, Kamau. And on Green Dreams, you can ask your question if it's related to the topic, and also just to our speakers, and then I'll give over to Arne to respond to Kamau.
Oh, thanks for having me up. And what a great space, good subject matter. All the speakers that spoke today had some really good points. I didn't really have a question per se. I just wanted to share some of the challenges I found. I grew hemp for a startup company for 1 year, and I'm currently the farm manager for a hop company, which grows hops for beer. And coincidentally, they're both in the same plant family and share a lot of the similar characteristics as far as insect pests and disease.
Thank you so much for contributing, and great to have you on the space. Arne, I'm going to give over to you just to contribute or respond to Kamau's questions, and then Tabile, I see you there as well. To also contribute, an agricultural economist at the NMC. Arne, over to you.
Kamau, most hemp is what's known as photosensitive. So most hemp require a certain number of daylight hours to grow vegetatively. And when these hours then decrease below a certain point is when flowering is then initiated. This is true for most hemp. There's no clear way to answer your question. But in the summer months, it's generally the best because of the long photo period, especially in open field. They want regular water as well. So if you're in a summer rain season, that's great. But my suggestion is to evaluate a lot of varieties to find one that is adapted to your situation, because every variety is going to respond differently. There's a really great Polish variety, for example, when grown in its homeland. I can't pronounce the name, which is why I don't mention it. In its natural environment, it grows 4 meters. When grown this side, you'd be lucky to have it reach 50 centimeters. And that's purely because the daylight just isn't long enough. Because in the Northern Hemisphere, there's this much more distinct difference in daylight temperatures. The best place to grow these varieties would be the Western Cape. And then for the rest, I would honestly urge you to look at Asian varieties as close to 30 degrees latitude as possible. And even then, you are going to a few varieties and see what. If it falls outside of your rainy season, then you should look at irrigation, of course.
Thanks so much, Arne. Kamau, I hope that answers your question. Remember, we have a guide also being published on Food for Mzansi that has all this vital information for any new farmer, beginner farmer, or someone who wants to diversify into the specific commodity that will be published on Food for Mzansi. So please do check out and watch the space as well. Tabile, the floor is yours.
We have a lot of folks that are interested in getting into it because it's something new, but also because it is providing like a great opportunity for typical South Africans. I'm just going to comment around the issue of, I think there was one speaker who raised like a very important issue around the whole hemp situation where it looks to be exclusive. I think we will have to first off understand, or at least put it at the back of our minds, that this industry is very young in South Africa. It's very young in terms of formalizing it. So that alone, it has opened a room for inheriting some issues that are already existing in South Africa. So that said, we will need to at least understand that we're not going to get this thing right from the get-going of it. Like it's very new. it is not going to be very easy to get it right. Now, in terms of tax speakers, alluding to the issues of the spaces available for hemp and stuff, I think it depends first of as to what are you going to produce the crop for. From the developed countries, of which the South African industry will say it is geared towards to at least it has been formed to look like. It is very formalized in that sense, and as a result, it looks to be exclusive in its nature. And that is, of course, as I said, that we're not going to get it right. There are things that we're going to get right as we're progressing with it. Normally, from the countries that I've seen that at least follow what is going around the industry, is that it normally is produced not necessarily in a very large space. And of course, it goes back to what variety that you're going to produce and what is it that you're going to produce the product for. So if you are to look, for an example, for medical purposes, it normally does not need a very, very big space, because South Africa still have the issue of land, not necessarily for the hemp itself, but even for other crops that we are trying to get into our ordinary folks to get access to. It's not very easy. And from what I'm getting from the little information or literature that we have in South Africa around this, it looks like not everyone is going to be able to get into it for now. And also look into the provinces in terms of the climate that the product can be grown in. There's a speaker that produced something like that, said something around Western Cape. It takes some policies, of course, that make the environment very conducive for one to get into. As so we see a model, or we get into a model that is going to be very, very useful, or at least to allow almost everyone to get into the space. I think then that's only when you're going to be able to see some progress. But for now, there's a lot of frustration. I know I'm coming from a province where hemp has been produced for over 100 years. Now, it has been there. I grew up, it was there, my forefathers and stuff. It is still there. But the issue of getting it in formalization part of it, that's where the issue is. So that's when I think we're going to have to get it right somehow. But of course, we're going to have to do a lot of research and follow to what other countries that have done it. We have our neighbor here next to us. Lesotho has been doing this thing excellently. But of course, even in Lesotho, the companies that invested in these are multinational companies overseas, meaning that the model that they've applied there, it is a model that was coming outside Lesotho per se. So that's why I was saying we're going to have to do a lot of reading around it just to observe a couple of things that other countries are doing right. And hopefully South Africa will be in a position to do that. But for now, it is not going to be very easy. As I was saying, that this whole marijuana hemp thing inherited some issues that we already have in South Africa from the agricultural industry and other industries supporting it. So it's not going to be easy, but I think there is hope for it. And I believe that colleagues or the farmers that would like to enter it, they should not despair. There's an opportunity for it. It can happen, but just that one needs to have, the right information, the right connection. You can do your research. Lesotho is very close to us. We can even go physically in Swaziland, talk to folks and see how they've managed.
Thank you so much. I'm so inspired, and really this has been such an eye-opener. And, kudos to our speakers, Dawn, for being pioneers in this industry that has such potential, right, to really alleviate some of our country's issues. So for me, just really riding on Tabile's lights at the end of the tunnel way. We understand that hemp, cannabis, and is cultivated primarily for industrial purposes. Everything is okay. There is an act that says that we are allowed to grow it. Great that we understand that. And we also do understand that, obviously, I think the bottleneck here is that, there's the transparency and the permits and traceability is something of the state's concern. Tabile touched on that. We have a lot of issues of, people being, addicted to marijuana, and we have a lot of social issues that come with weed and marijuana, being something that's kind of shunned upon. Just for young aspiring farmers, what really is missing here, because I feel like we need some sort of act to be our starting point, because right now the regulations is all complex. We can't be focusing heavily on all of that. We need to start relying on getting farmers involved in the cultivation of hemp. Because at the end of the day, it seems like we're playing catch up with the rest of the world. So maybe what can be our motivation for young farmers starting this? I know it is capital intensive and we need to lean on the already existing value chains, but I just would like our speakers to really give us maybe motivation on how we can really channel this thing and really go forward as young as we are with little to no money, but really the drive to pioneer this. Anyone can take my question.
I'd just like to briefly comment on the gentleman's conversation just a minute ago. Northern California farmers are facing similar situations like you spoke to, where there's been farmers that have grown cannabis outdoors for decades, and now they're competing with massive corporate indoor grows. It's a challenge for them. As far as hemp goes, with growing anything, if you don't have infrastructure to receive what you grow, then you really can't grow it. So what I'm saying is, if you're growing hemp for CBD extraction, the way you're going to grow it is similar to like an orchard where the spacing is like 5-foot rows, 5-foot spacing. And you're going to treat it more like a tree. And when you harvest, you're going to have to dry it. And then you're going to have to extract it, which is massive lab extraction equipment. If you're going the other way with textiles with hemp, again, you need a place to bring it after it's been initially processed and dried. So if I'm in Michigan in the USA, the closest hemp textile company is in Kentucky. I wouldn't make any money if I had to ship all my biomass by rail car. So it's kind of like the industry is so young because it's been under prohibition for 80 plus years, is that we're still trying to discover things and we still have to put that infrastructure. And it's kind of like you can't put the cart before the horse, but at the same time you kind of need to. So it needs to kind of come together.
Thanks so much for your contribution, Green Dreams. And I think it's amazing that we can, all gather to grow here internationally and, hear from people from all over the world. Sibusiso, I think that you wanted to contribute as well and just respond to Gugu's question.
So I think the fascinating thing with cannabis is that cannabis is believed to be one of the first, if not the first, domesticated plant by human beings over 10,000 years ago in Asia. We've had essentially a 10,000-year relationship with cannabis. So everything from the flower being used for medicines and spiritual purposes and wellness, etc., to the material being used to effectively help industrialize the world over this period. And we know that both on the medicinal side, on the industrial side, the world that we live in where cannabis is reintegrated into society is a better world than we live in today. And so as young people and as entrepreneurs and people with energy and ambition and so forth, I think the destination in terms of cannabis in society is a huge motivation. We've mentioned a lot of the challenges that come with the cannabis industry at present, and over the next couple of months and years, a lot is going to change and it's going to become easier. But the ability to be part of that story and be an actor in kind of bringing cannabis back into society is, I think, almost a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. For example, you think about the industrial applications of hemp. One thing that hasn't been quite mentioned is the fact that hemp actually has approximately a 4 times higher carbon dioxide absorption factor than other similar crops, which over time, we believe is going to fit into a credit sequestration model. And so for me personally, and I think for many people, especially young people that I know that are in this industry or looking to go into this industry, the biggest motivation is the impact that you can make in terms of building sustainable, let's say, hemp cultivation operations, or getting into the medical space to help people in terms of their health and as a substitute to pharmaceutical drugs, which can be extremely dangerous over long periods of time. I think the mission in terms of how much good we can do as young people in terms of putting our hearts and souls into building cannabis businesses and initiatives is pretty incredible. It's definitely, as mentioned, the industry is very much in its early stages and comes from an unfortunate history of it being categorized as an extremely dangerous, addictive substance that destroys people's lives. And we've seen that none of that is true. You look at a country like Canada, which has had a fully legal cannabis industry for almost 4 years, and use of hard drugs and so forth has actually, cannabis has had little to no impact, a decline from that perspective. So all these fears that are peddled around cannabis and what happens to society when it's freely available and so forth are being debunked because we've got real case studies across the world. So my parting words from that perspective would be, it's an opportunity to be part of a global movement that in 10, 15 years' time will look back and say, what an incredible contribution we've made in our communities, in our society, in our country, and in the world.
For budding farmers, the advice is just to start small. Find a part of the plant that you really like and try plant the crop. Get yourself a few varieties. They are available if you know where to look. To grow for biomass, well, grow a small plot of hemp. If you don't sell it, it's not illegal. And the Constitutional Court has given us permission to grow for personal use. Grow some hemp. You can tell the officers that you're growing a house. Upskill yourself. Grow hemp on a small parcel if that's how you want to grow it. Familiarize yourself with the plant. Don't spend too much money if you don't know how to court investors. Just play with it. Upskill yourself. If you want to go into marijuana, do horticultural courses. Find out what other countries are doing with their cannabis production. If you do hemp, look at how it's grown. Look at what varieties might work for you, and definitely come to grips with what is needed to drive a economically feasible hemp farm. While we wait for government to get their act together, licensing will eventually ease because government will see that cannabis doesn't have this social impact that South Africa's favorite hobby, alcohol, has, that it actually has this potential. But what budding farmers need to do is familiarize themselves with how to grow the plant and how to partake in an industry and not just be able to grow the good, but actually play your part in it. As a warning, there is something in the industry called the hemp trap. And this hemp trap is, there's so much to do with this one plant that most budding entrepreneurs get lost in all the options. I mean, you are literally sport for choice. Be wary of this and try and focus your energy on one or two subsectors of this very useful plant, because otherwise your efforts are going to come to nil. Many of us, I think, in the industry have suffered this at one point or another, and many are still suffering it. Don't spread yourself too thinly. Grow the plant, find a good use for it, and buy that market, and wait and fight for government to bring in rational cannabis policies.
Thanks so much. I think our speakers here have so much vital information. Thanks so much for your contributions, Anne. I see we have 2 hands up from Green Dreams and Christina. I'm going to give Kansai a chance to just share her contributions as a main speaker, and then I'll give over to the last 2 to contribute, and then we'll have to wrap up for the evening. Kansai, over to you.
For me, it's not even as much to the budding entrepreneurs because they really need all the support, right? Otherwise, a large number of our small-scale producers are going to be excluded from all of this, like Tabile has mentioned, as well as Busiso and Arnay. So whoever is on this call and involved, whether it's in the body of the cannabis associations or the companies themselves, I put an action item to them to lobby and have those discussions with government to see if they can maybe, make more lenient policy decisions regarding this development in the cannabis industry, because it is still young. There's still room to make those adjustments before it is set in stone. And if the president did say that this is an industry they want to look at uplifting the social economic standing in South Africa and uplifting the high unemployment number, and they're looking at the Eastern Cape, they're looking at KZN, they're looking at Limpopo, which is like the rural economies, then we need to include those people by having policies in place that are not excluding them. I mean, when I look at this licensing agreement and the costs, it's definitely too high of a cost and a barrier for them to enter the market. And I think about just financially also going to look for assistance from the institutions. This is definitely going to be an excluding factor. So for me, I know there's a huge interest. All the speakers have said, and the people that have also commented that, it is definitely, there is potential, but we need to get our house in order before we can say that this is where we want to invest. Otherwise, we are going to exclude our rural economy. And then we're going to be finding crime rates still going up because the high number of South Africans are still unemployed.
Thanks so much, Kansai. And I think you have contributed a bit to one of my questions that I wanted to still ask around government's role and especially how we see it playing out with government. So thanks so much for that contribution. Christina, I'm going to give you the floor, and then Green Dreams after Christina. Thanks.
I just wanted to add, did anybody attend the Sustainable Built Environment Conference that was hosted in Overberg on the 28th of March? Now, this has been going on for 10 years, even if you missed out. If you visit the website, you're going to find a whole lot of people that you can connect with around sustainable building. And, just hearing how difficult it is to navigate the regulatory framework and being tripped up by potency and purity and rules and things. Hempcrete and building houses that are potentially carbon neutral and energy efficient and sustainable is certainly a need in South Africa. And I encourage you to go to, can't find the website now. I'll post it on my Twitter so you can look for it there.
Thanks, Christina. And thanks so much for contributing and sharing on the space. Green Dreams, the floor is yours.
Just get out and just grow a few seeds just to see how it grows. Just kind of see, the differences. It is variety specific depending on what you're growing for. One consideration is, as well as the textiles and for medicinal or recreational use, is growing for grain, for seed. Hemp seed is probably one of the most nutritious seeds on the planet. It's high in omega-3s and omega-6s. And you can press it for oil. You can just feed the seed cake, the leftover, to livestock. It just has many, many uses. So I just wanted to add that. And thank you for having this space. It was fantastic.
Thanks, Green Dreams. And then maybe just a comment from Trish. Apologies, he had to cut because of his connectivity. But his last comment was just for anyone who wants to participate in the commercial sector. He says that the key point would be to know your buyer and your capacity to facilitate the expectations. So that's just his last comment as well. Of course, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for contributing tonight. It was absolutely amazing to hear from you, to pick your brains, for you to share the knowledge and your experience in the industry so far. And I do hope, Gugu, that we can engage much further on this topic on later spaces beyond Gather to Grow, and just engage even more and just figure out how new players in the game can really make the most of this industry. and really, move with it as it's moving with us as well here in South Africa, but also internationally. Good, thanks, Gugu, and thanks so much